Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast, and welcome back to the podcast from our little unscheduled hiatus we've had. Apologies for that. We're still down a man here, literally, as Nick is gallivanting around France and planning his adventures this summer.
Lucky, lucky.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, we've been a little busy the last few weeks. I've been, let's see, from my perspective, I've
What have
been
you been
struggling with
doing?
no computer and I've been moving around to camps and planning things. And yeah, Nick has been balancing school and now travel to all this.
So
And
nice.
exactly, going to France and having croissants and not pronouncing the word fully as he tries to speak French, probably. And you, Michela, I guess you've been busy with some changes in life, some good changes in life. If you want to give any details on that, that would be awesome.
Sure, I got some exciting news. I have a new position. I'm actually moving to Massachusetts. I got hired as their freshwater turtle biologist for UMass Fish and Wildlife. So I'm going to be doing that. Actually, I've been really busy, and hence why I've been on here too, is because I've been preparing for the move. Really just kind of staring at everything and procrastinating. I am not packed whatsoever, but I leave in about a week and a half, and then I'm going to be starting off a new adventure from Michigan to Mass. The pretty much the same weather, but there's some hills, so it's there's not much of a difference. I mean, I'm gonna be a little close to the ocean. I'm kind
I
of
was gonna
excited
say
about
you've got ocean. That's a bit of a difference.
that's
That's
true. I do,
you've also
but
got a significantly better baseball park if you want to go see baseball. But I'm just saying, Fenway Park's amazing.
yeah,
There you go.
uh,
I know you don't care, but there you
no.
go. Yeah,
I like the Tigers. Don't
there's nothing
don't
wrong
yeah,
with the Tigers,
oh,
but you can go
baseball.
to Fenway when the Tigers play there. I'll be a Blue Jay fan
True.
for life, but I still love Fenway. Come on, it's
All
amazing. So
right, all right. I guess
yeah.
I'll have to go and take a video to show everyone that I
Oh
went
please, God,
just for
it's
you.
you can't be live in that area and not go there once. It's amazing.
I probably will, but yeah, I'm really excited. So
That's awesome.
that's the new move
That's
and
awesome.
new news. Thanks, I
That's super
appreciate it.
cool. So yeah, I
Yeah.
guess we've all been pretty busy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually today's been crazy. I woke up. Well, let's see, the last 2 weeks went finished off our 6 weeks at our sort of normal research station, and then literally like the next morning went to scout a new research station, and then
Wow.
went to another city, and then another city, and then after that, when we came back, I just finished leading a tour for family. Don't usually lead tours, but occasionally I do a little, guiding for families and people on the side. And I just got back from that this afternoon. And then tomorrow morning, we go to our next field site, which is up in the cloud forests of the Andes. I'll be there a month. So,
Cool.
yeah, it's going to be, it's been a lot. The biggest news, the most impressive news is that we are very close to a technically perfect episode today, I believe, maybe because I have a new computer, which is amazing. Yay!
Drum roll. Woo.
And last episodes, which may or may not have happened 3 weeks ago. So,
Oh
um,
no.
poor that episode was that was tough. So we'll get that
Oh,
episode back one day. We'll redo it again.
yeah.
But yeah, it's been a bit of a journey for all of us, and thanks for having the patience and tuning back into this episode. Those of you watching,
I'm
and
gonna be
yeah,
back.
yeah, hopefully
Mhm.
we'll be back on the schedule with at least two of the three of us every week, if not all three of us every
Mhm.
week. And yeah, so this episode, we have it's actually cool because he actually contacted us through our
This
Instagram.
one's actually cool.
No, well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. The others were, but this is no. But it's cool because we actually got a guest who contacted us, which was great, through our Instagram, Ethan Tapper, and he's a forester from Vermont, and yeah, he's actually got a new book coming out, and yeah, he's going to speak to us. Obviously, a little bit about the book, but mostly about his background and his life in forestry and his perspectives on forestry. And yeah, he's the first forester, botanist, forestry sort of person we've had on.
Mhm.
Um, Understandably, for yourself, Michaela, and myself, and even Nick with wildlife photography, we often get pretty focused on the animals, the vertebrates, and other things that are living in the forest. But we all know as biologists and ecologists that the forest is the foundation. Without it and the complexities and health of it, we're not able to study what we want to study, right? So this
Exactly.
is really cool to
Mhm.
have on. I'm excited to see his perspectives and pick his brain on some questions. It should be awesome.
Yeah, me too. I'm just excited to learn something outside of terrestrial vertebrates. So, uh,
Yeah, yeah,
and
no,
then just to kind of compare, Michigan forestry. I know a little bit about Michigan forestry to the out east, and kind of learn a little bit more about out east. As again, I'm moving out there, so
yeah. Yeah, no, it should be good. So
yeah.
without further ado, let's go ahead and hit it. Let's go.
Mhm.
All right, so we have Ethan Tapper joining us on the podcast today, and Ethan's a forester and also soon to be author from Bolton, Vermont. And yeah, I mean, you're actually the first, I guess, forest botany background person guest we've had on the show so far. And as you can probably tell by that pretty stunted and clunky intro, this is not my field of expertise. I often hear that. I think I can safely say the same for you as well, Michela.
That's why I had to introduce.
It's usually, I know there's those weird people who do both amazingly well, but generally there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between, people who work with vertebrates and people who work with plants and trees. So I'm definitely in the vertebrate, area. I think you are as well, Michela.
Oh,
And
for sure.
yeah, so some of well, everything you're going to say to us today is probably really interesting. And then some of the questions we may have might be a little on the basic side. But yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. And yeah, go ahead and get right at it. Give us some background about your background and what you do, and what a forester is, so to speak, as well.
Sure. Yeah. So listening to these back episodes of this podcast, Chris has been talking a lot of smack about, trees and plant people. So it's time we clap back. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so yeah, so I'm a forester. My name's Ethan Tapper. I'm from Vermont, and I'm a forester actually for the last 8 years. Since 2016, I've been the Chittenden County Forester for the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. So Vermont, tiny state in the northeast corner of the United States. Um, and the county foresters, we're broken up into these big counties, and the county foresters are service foresters that work with primarily private landowners in our county, but we work for actually the state of Vermont.
Okay.
And so the interesting thing to know about the eastern United States, right, is that especially even in some of these primarily forested states. So Vermont is like 75% forested. 80% of the land is privately owned.
Mhm.
So it's a very interesting dynamic, actually, right? Because we have these ecosystems that we're deriving like massive public benefits from: clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration and storage, biodiversity protection, wildlife habitat, all of these like fundamental human benefits, not to mention like cultural benefits, spiritual benefits, economic benefits. Um, and most of the protection of those benefits is actually outsourced to private landowners.
Mhm.
So the reason that the county forester program exists, and the reason that service foresters, public foresters who help advise landowners to manage their land better, the reason that exists is because we really need to help private landowners understand how to take care of all that really important stuff. So in that capacity for the last 8 years, I manage like this program is called a current use program. It's a tax abatement program incentivizing people to manage their land better, basically in exchange for a tax break and to not subdivide or develop their land. Provide service to private landowners, so anybody in the county can just call me up and get advice on how to manage their land responsibly, and we can talk about what's going on and what might be some next steps that we could take. I also manage a bunch of small scale public forests. We call them town forests or municipal forests, about 5,000 acres of those, for demonstration and education, and then do a lot of education and outreach. So I have a YouTube channel, Instagram, TikTok, write monthly column in a bunch of newspapers here, a quarterly column in this really awesome magazine called Northern Woodlands. If anyone listening is from the Northeastern United States, that's an awesome one to pick up. Yeah, and dozens of public events a year. Just really realizing that there is a massive gap between, number one, just like people's understanding of how forests work. There are
Mhm.
so many misconceptions and misunderstandings about how these ecosystems even function. And then also, then sort of by extension, what it means to care for them.
Mhm.
And massive like misconceptions about, or at the very least, like lack of nuance about like what forest management is and the work that foresters do. So I've been doing that. Actually, on June 1st, I'll be leaving to start my own private consulting forestry company called Bear Island Forestry. Most of the foresters in Vermont, because all of these lands are privately owned, are actually these private consulting foresters who work for private forest landowners and to publicize this book, How to Love a Forest, which I'm really, really excited about, which comes out on September 10th.
Very
Cool.
exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's lots of questions that come to my mind. And yeah, I guess the first one I'll go with is, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm always really interested in when it comes to forests is, and I guess it's for working here in the Amazon, you start to learn again that a forest that from a satellite image looks intact is not always intact in the way that it sort of would have been, pre-anthropogenic impact, and we all know pine stands that are just rows of pines from above. It's green, but it's not a really fully functioning ecosystem, right? So I guess two-part question in the same vein is, can you elaborate on that topic a bit more?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, I'm curious what the structure of like the forests in Vermont and that sort of northeastern corner, are from your perspective as a forester. And I guess, like historically, there's been so much change, and even, species extinctions and selective logging going back, a century. Maybe build on that a bit from a coniferous, deciduous, temperate zone forest point of view, and where we're at now.
It's remarkably complex, and that's one thing that is really important to understand. Like, you really can't have a firm grasp on how forests work here in the Northeast without understanding their history.
Yeah.
And so what I tell people in Vermont is, like, every forest you've ever been in was a pasture in the 1800s. I mean, it was, the land clearing was that extensive. We had a historic low of, we think, like 20% forest, but a forest that were actually true old growth is well below 1/10 of 1%.
Yeah.
So we have these like incredible impacts associated with that land clearing, but then also, across our landscape, forests that are incredibly young and simple and haven't had time to develop all these characteristics that really define forests for thousands of years, and then by extension, like, all of the species that are native to here adapted to these conditions for thousands of years. And the forests that we have today just don't have them. So when you have forests that have, they were all a pasture within 100 years, usually it's a single generation of trees of species capable of growing in an old pasture, and they don't have all of these characteristics like dead wood on the ground, dead standing trees, big old trees, gaps in the canopy, all of these different elements of diversity, both within a forest and across the landscape, that are just like so vital to the function of that ecosystem, providing habitat for all of the native species, and then also even doing things like providing resilience as we move into a changing climate, and a biodiversity crisis. So, like, one of the things that, on my journey is moving from this place of, like, I just wanted to protect forests. I just love forests and I wanted to care for them. And I think that one of the sort of oversimplified conceptions that a lot of people have about it is that what it means to care for a forest, right, is to leave it alone, and we just like protect it. Maybe we conserve it. We protect it from anything happening to it, any people doing anything to it, right? But then, even if you conserve a piece of land, right, that could be just the beginning. That piece of that ecosystem is still, may need help, maybe facing all of these incredible wounds of the past, incredible threats and stressors in the present, this incredibly uncertain future. And I believe we have a responsibility, where appropriate, to help our ecosystems heal. So, like, you mentioned different species. Like, it's pretty mind blowing when you start to break down like how much all these things have changed. Like, white-tailed deer is now our main large herbivore. Probably wasn't even really in the state 300 years ago. Our main large predator is coyotes. They were first seen in the state in like the 1940s. We think that in our valleys we had massive influence from beavers driving the composition of these forests and our hydrology. So, like, 300 beaver dams per square mile. So I can't convert that into hectares, but it's like beaver dam every 2 acres. So like a beaver dam every hectare. So it's, that would have had a massive influence on habitat. That would have had a massive influence on soil formation and disturbances and hydrology and like all of these incredible things. And then, so, at times the alterations to these ecosystems are so severe that it's like, if we want to really protect their function and the species that live here, sometimes we got to do stuff to take care of them. It's not enough just to leave them alone.
Yeah. Really well said. That's really interesting. I'm really excited to hear more about this as well. I'm actually moving to Massachusetts for a new job. So I'm not as familiarized with the East Side in terms of, especially the terrestrial aspect of that. So to kind of have a better understanding from your perspective versus mine, again, mine's a little bit more reptile and
Mhm.
amphibian based, but it's still, obviously it coincides really well. So that's really very fascinating. My question for you too is, you're talking about how there's a lot of misconceptions. What is the most common misconception that you gather from the private landowners, and how do you are they willing to work with you all? I know that at least in Michigan or in the Midwest, a lot of times our private landowners and our farmers
Mhm.
are not always as willing to work with biologists, because I think there's just a really large gap, and again, in knowledge in between both of what the benefits are for both sides. So
Mhm.
how do you close that gap? And yeah.
Yeah, there's so the main misconceptions I would say, there's misconceptions about how forests work.
Mhm.
A book that I thought was really pretty unhelpful in that respect was that book, The Hidden Life of Trees, um, which
Oh,
is
okay.
I regard, and most people in the forestry community regard, as essentially fiction based on some legitimate research, which some of that research is now in question as well. But um, the anthropomorphizing of trees and ecosystems, I really struggle with. And so, because it's like, when you actually look at how these ecosystems function, you can see that like tree mortality and change can be these like incredibly positive and important parts of forest ecology. And if you were to take like a bunch of ecologists out to an old growth forest, they would be looking at not like the big living trees in a lot of cases, but like the dead standing trees and the dead wood on the ground and
Right.
the multi-generational forest that resulted from millennia of disturbances from trees dying in that forest regenerating. All of those things are like arguably as essential and certainly as normal to the forest as living trees, right?
Mm.
So like people then seeing the death of trees as this huge tragedy because trees are just like people and forests are these utopian societies and we got to keep all the trees alive forever. It's just a misunderstanding of how forests work. And I often ask myself um, why we have to mythologize and like anthropomorphize trees and forests when what they already are is like totally amazing. But that's sort of a whole nother thing. But so another thing is like we also have a pretty innate misconception of what a healthy forest looks like. For whatever reason, everybody wants their forest to look like a park. It's just like ingrained in us. And E.O. Wilson, my guy E.O. Wilson, famous biologist, who I'm sure many people listening to this know, um, he suspects that this is actually evolutionary in nature. There's some research suggesting that we're predisposed to these like savanna-like environments because those are the environments that we evolved in for millions of years. But anyway, people have this tremendous desire to create these forests that look like parks, and to clean everything up and have it be just like healthy trees, evenly spaced, no dead wood on the ground. You can see right through the understory of that forest, which is almost the opposite of what a healthy
Mm.
forest actually look like when you compare it to our remnant old growth forests. And those forests are just so bereft of so many really important things. And
Mm.
then, so that sort of misconceptions about forests. And also I would argue that, people see forests as these like static, unchanging systems when I see them as these like incredibly dynamic systems. And then the other misconceptions are about like what forestry is, and sort of, conflating all forestry or all tree cutting as something done by people who don't care. And we're only interested in extracting stuff from the forest. And we're all like industry interests and all we care about is money. And, it couldn't be further from the truth. And there are certainly like forests that are managed that way. I was just out on the West Coast and saw some forests that are definitely like pretty industrial forests that are managed on short rotations for forest products, period.
Mm.
Um, but then, like over here, almost every forest is managed for a wide array of different things. And I actually really see harvesting wood from a forest, which by the way, wood, of course, is like a local renewable resource that's, carries with them these incredible suite of like ecological, human, cultural benefits. And we really need more of them in a changing climate. But I see the fact that we can make forest management commercial as a means to like do ecosystem restoration at scale. So all the forest management that I do, I'm doing it with loggers and skidders and chainsaws and logging equipment But I've realized that actually everything I do can be in service of trying to make these simplified degraded forests healthier and more like old growth forests, putting dead wood on the ground, putting gaps in the canopy, encouraging that multi-generationality, encouraging a more diverse composition. We can do all those things, and they can we can do it at scale, hundreds of acres a year, with one logger. And that lends us this incredible amount of power. And so a lot of this stuff, like reframing how we think, reimagining how we think about forest, reimagining how we think about forest management, and was what really inspired me to write the book, How to Love a Forest. Just because I didn't really hear anybody like talking about this kind of stuff. Even when I was in forestry school, these weren't things that anybody told me. But to me, now they're like the foundation of what I think our relationship with forests and forest management should be.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of questions, but we don't have too much time. Can you, so I have two, sorry, Michela, I'm just going to throw, one is a follow-up to this, and then I'll have a additional, quick follow-up. So then what you're saying makes total sense, ecologically. And I mean, again, I think you would agree, Michela, as two people here who are focused more on the terrestrial vertebrate side, we both know these little microclimates that are created by fallen trees and dead wood and tree falls gaps and diversity of vegetation. I mean, that's exactly how we get the species we want to study, so I totally get it 100%. And actually in a super diverse area like the Amazon, you see how those microclimates are even more visceral and more in your face. So being from where I'm from in Canada, it's the same, but down here, it's really in your face that these little changes change all the diversity and community structure. So yeah, I guess what I'm wondering from your perspective is, okay, so land management and sort of speeding up the process a bit, or already trying to something we already kind of wrecked. We're kind of help it be better. It's kind of like you could view hunting, and people like anti-hunting white-tailed deer, but there's also too many deer, so we kind of have no choice because we already got rid of all the wolves and the cougars. So yeah, I get it. Well, I think we're probably all three of us on the same page there. But the question I would have then is, from your perspective, would you tend to lean toward then, like you mentioned, old growth forests, like let's say primary, never touched, those tiny remnants that exist? Would you say that those areas are probably functioning at a level that they wouldn't really need or benefit significantly from management? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that that's true with a couple of exceptions. Like I think that they would, and there's a whole range of different management approaches, and I would also advocate for leaving for not managing every acre of the world, but also leaving some areas to become old growth on their own. But so the exceptions to that are non-native invasive plants, pests, and pathogens.
Yeah, of course.
And deer overpopulation. Those would be the big ones here. Like for me, even if you're gonna do nothing in the sense of no, you're not going to cut any trees, you're not going to do any active management, the minimum responsible level of management is dealing with non-native plants, non-native invasive plants, and stuff like deer overpopulation. Because what people don't understand, those processes, that forest to become an old growth forest or to continue to provide all of those biodiversity benefits, it needs to be able to regenerate, right? And if every time a tree falls over, that gap is filled with a monoculture of these non-native invasive plants, or a lot of species can't grow because deer eat them all. It's not functioning in the way that it needs to. So there's sort of an inherent baseline level of responsibility there.
I think, not to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're saying, and I would agree with, is that in so much of the world, certainly in Western world, well, let's be honest, most of the world, especially where there is overpopulations and invasive species so prevalent, we just can't sit back and have a romantic idea of leaving a forest alone, because we've gone past that tipping point where now it's kind of our responsibility to try to be involved, especially since we don't have enough habitat left that's untouched to just let it work itself out, So that makes sense. I understand that. It's really good. Well explained too.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think that that's, what sort of the book is about. And I want to talk about this too when I talk about, tell my story, but again, I just feel like there's such a dichotomy sometimes especially with people who don't do this work that we do, and it makes perfect sense in a lot of ways, where you're if you love ecosystems and you love biodiversity, you leave them alone, because it makes no sense that a cutting of a tree or the killing of a deer or whatever, could ever be an act of compassion to an ecosystem. I think that's completely reasonable. Then, of course, it requires this level of like deep understanding that we have. And then the other side of that dichotomy, right, is like the people who do all that stuff must not care.
No.
And sort of what my whole book is about is sort of like coming out the other side of that and realizing that actually taking these radical actions, which require us to do these like bittersweet things like cutting trees, killing deer, killing invasive plants, those are like the most radical acts of compassion of them all.
Yeah.
Because they're so hard.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of those, very little life is black and white, right? It's mostly gray. So, you can't say that every person who hunts and every person who cuts a tree is evil, but also there are people who do clear cut felling and where they probably shouldn't. And there's people who poach animals. They definitely shouldn't. So as always, there's gradients and balances, and finding the balance is the key, right? So, it's really important. And I think almost all people who start to truly understand ecosystems and the functionality of it would understand that. And probably most of the people who don't probably understand it just probably don't have the knowledge base to really understand how complex it is.
Or I say, sorry.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I say this thing about sometimes I do workshops on communication, like communicating the work we do for foresters, because we have been so bad. We all know it. It's not like a big news item. We've been so bad at communicating our work and the nuance of it. But I do believe that most people support responsible forest management. They just don't know it yet.
Agreed.
Right? They haven't been told in a way that resonates with them. And that shows how some of this work that we're doing that on the surface can seem really confusing is actually totally in line with all of these, things that everybody cares about, like protecting biodiversity, like protecting water quality, and, all these other, building climate resilience, all these other things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think also, too, it's that we need to start targeting science in more of a holistic way, just as we're starting to realize with the human anatomy. You're having some mental illness and you go to a psychiatrist, and then you're having a stomach ache and you're going to, the endocrinologist, and then why are we not connecting both together? So the way that we have been practicing science and biology and ecology for so long, we've been diversifying and we're putting them in different brackets. But now, the whole point is we need to really kind of recognize how interconnected it all is, and we learn that in school, right? But then yet when we get out in the world, we don't really practice that. And so I think that it's really important for us to start really practicing it more holistically and looking at the situation more holistically as well, instead of just these are my expertise and this is all I know about, but really how is this going to not only affect other different trophic levels, but humans as well, because we have to really think about that. But yeah, no, it's super fascinating. So I'm curious too, you were talking about you've only been doing this, what you said, 8 years, they said, right?
I've been doing it now 12 years.
12 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. How did you start? What really made you interested in the whole forest aspect? You grew up out there, I'm assuming you said you're from there?
Yeah, I'm from Vermont.
Right.
So basically, it's kind of funny. Like whenever I on a podcast like this, talks to natural resource professionals or whatever we call ourselves, right? About like how we got into it. I feel like everybody's like, yeah, I was like the bug kid, and I like crawled around the ground looking for bugs, or like I was always that way, and that wasn't the case for me at all. Like I was just, I grew up in a really rural village in southeastern Vermont called Saxton's River. It's like, I don't know, 300 people or something, surrounded by forests. Almost all of Vermont is forested, but they weren't places that I was like, I'm forest kid. Interestingly, so what happened to me was I was fortunate to get a really good scholarship to the University of Vermont, but didn't really know what I wanted to study. And then like my first serious girlfriend, like my first big love, went on this like expedition. It was like sort of this outward bound type expedition with this organization called Croca Expeditions in southern New Hampshire. And she came back, and I had just finished a semester of school, not knowing what I wanted to do. And she had this big experience, and I like couldn't relate to her. And I was terrified as like a 18-year-old that I wasn't that like we were going to have to break up because I couldn't understand this big experience that she had. So with
So
2 weeks notice, I signed up for the next expedition, which was a 6-month winter. We like skied north for 2 months and then built a canoe and canoed back down, basically.
Mhm.
And that ended up being this transformative experience. I worked as a wilderness guide after that, and then apprenticed with a horse logger, logging with draft horses, and then with another like sort of rural primitive skills type folks in northern Maine, and then UVM, the University of Vermont, was like, you got to come back, you're going to lose your scholarship. And I remember literally looking at the list of different majors, a paper list, which probably 10 years or 12 years later doesn't, or 14 years later doesn't exist. But I saw forestry, and I didn't know what it was. All I knew is it had the word forest in it. It sounded cool. So I just chose that, and it ended up being like a really cool, a really good fit for me, obviously, because I'm just like love my job, and it's just been such a joy. But yeah, went into it solely just like I love forests. I want to take care of forests, and then not like I like running a skidder,
yeah,
and I want to do it from that direction. I was like, how do we care for forests? And
yeah.
then that has sort of led me to where I am now.
Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, it wasn't certainly wasn't a straight line. But I
Yeah.
really am interested in, I have this theory that nobody like when I first started realizing what forestry was, I was like, oh, we got to cut trees. And at that time, I was thinking about it solely as like a means to produce a resource, not as a means to like restore ecosystems. But I was like, we got to cut them. So I love trees intrinsically, and so I should be the one who decides which ones we cut. Um, but now I'm like thinking about next generations of foresters, like, let's start from there, like starting from a place of like, we love trees and like, we totally care for these ecosystems intrinsically, and then let's figure out how to manage them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's awesome. I mean, I feel like I definitely have more questions. You probably do as well, Michela. But why don't we go ahead? We can save that for maybe a future interview. Maybe you can join us again in the future.
Great.
Why don't we go ahead and transition to your story now? So I'm curious. Maybe the one time you almost chopped off your foot with a chainsaw or something like that. No, I'm kidding. I'm curious what.
Yeah, I've
I was
got
like,
some
did
of
he tell you
those.
this beforehand?
I actually,
Your story is, so go for it.
yeah, I actually have had two sort of like close calls like that. But actually, so one of them does tie in. So I am gonna break the rules a little bit, in that I want to sort of tell um, a little bit more of a lot. It's not like a single day in the field, but like
Yeah,
a little bit of a longer story in terms of like spanning over a little bit longer time.
yeah.
So on that expedition that I just talked about, which is in 2009, so we'd been on this whole thing for 6 months, and at the end of it, we were doing like a little service project. We were putting up this timber frame barn, doing like construction essentially.
Mhm.
And I got in an accident on that. I was cranking this come along, winching these two posts together, and the rope that the come along was attached to snapped, came back and hit me in the face. Um, and I'm blind in my left eye still to
Wow.
this day as a result of that. Another thing that I really connect with my guy E.O. Wilson on is that we're both monocular people.
Oh my.
And
Always the left
so
eye. I've
Oh,
almost lost left eye 3 times as well. So it's always the left eye, man. I don't know what it is.
you
yeah,
boys. I don't get it.
Wow.
and I
I
actually,
feel you, yeah.
as an aside, later got in a chainsaw accident and got hit with a tree right in the right eye.
That's
And
scary.
crushed
Yeah.
this whole area around the right side of my eye, but I'm totally fine, miraculously. Anyway, so that's an aside.
Mm.
Uh, so at the time, it didn't feel like anything good came out of that moment.
Mhm.
But as a result of that, I got this insurance settlement that was a couple $100,000. And so I had this money that I was like, this is going to be the money that then I spend on this piece of land that I'm going to buy. And we had this idyllic vision of this homestead and, like living there with all my friends, and we're going to have like a big orchard and it's going to be beautiful. And I was looking for that piece of land and living in Burlington, which is Vermont's biggest city.
Mhm.
It's only like 60,000 people, but in the Burlington area, we have a quarter of the people in Vermont, which is 150,000 people. And so it's like, it was the hardest to find land for cheap in that area. And there was this one piece of land that was just sitting on the market for years. And I could see it was on this realtor's website, basically no pictures of anything. It just had this picture of this view of this mountain that we call Camel's Hump, that the indigenous people here call the Sitting Place Mountain. And that's all they showed, because that was the site where you were going to put your big estate house, right? That's what they were selling it, just essentially as real estate. But it was 175 acres. So I was like, what's wrong with it? Why? And it was listed for like $225,000, which here was like very cheap compared to the other prices I was seeing. So I was like, it's been on the market for 2 years. It's listed for less money. I'll go check it out. So I drove up to it. It was this a day in spring, kind of like now when things were starting to bud out here, but there weren't leaves on the trees, and there wasn't really anything green going on in the understory. The birds were just barely starting to come back, and drove up onto the landing. The road to get up there was just like completely washed out. There was a big ravine down the middle of it. They hadn't done any like water bars or any means to divert the water to protect that road, and so I had to like straddle it with the tires of my truck and get up to the clearing that was in the picture on the realtor's website. There was logging trash everywhere, just like busted pieces of machines, skidder cables, hydraulic fluid buckets and hoses, ruts everywhere. And it was not a promising beginning. Started taking ticks off my pants, and I was like, whatever, I'm here, let's go take a walk. Started walking, and pretty quickly discovered that this place had been pretty brutally high graded. So high grading is a type of logging. It's really not forest management. It's really probably closer to mining, where you basically just go into the forest and you cut all the healthiest, most valuable trees. And you leave all of the least healthy, less valuable trees there to grow. Mm-hmm. There's an argument to be made that high grading can be more harmful than clear cutting, because you are, not even giving a new generation of trees that have a chance to be healthy a chance to grow. You're just literally doing like reverse forest management, trying to select for the unhealthiest trees by cutting all the healthiest, most valuable ones. It's just about extraction, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I realized pretty quickly, I was like, this place got high graded really bad 30 years ago. Loggers were here. They just took all the most valuable trees. And I was walking for a while. All the skid trails were rutted and eroding. And I was standing on this ridge looking down through the forest, and I realized that I was like, there are no healthy trees here. Not one. I was like, I haven't seen one. Just as a result of that management. It was discouraging. And then I started walking through more. One of the things that's really interesting about the forest here is we have this species, American beech tree species, that was in this forest probably 40 to 60% of all the trees 300 years ago, prior to colonization. And it was massive tree, really this anchor keystone species of this forest that was capable of becoming really massive, 400 years old, and providing all this really important food for wildlife. And now it has this disease called beech bark disease, which prevents it from being usually more than 40 years old. And then it dies, it clones itself. Deer don't browse it, and they browse all the other trees. So you can end up with this like beech monoculture. And the logging that the loggers had done 30 years prior basically perfectly created that. So we had 100% unhealthy diseased beech trees in the overstory, 100% unhealthy diseased beech trees in the understory, clones that was just, in the self-perpetuating cycle. I walked over these cliffs that sort of bisect the property and came upon the worst infestation of non-native invasive plants that I had ever seen. 30 acres, Japanese barberry, just waist high and pure.
Screw that.
Yeah, it was also like, it was like up against the highway, which was really loud. And there was a huge 150-foot wide double power line corridor. And, it was just discouraging. Yeah. And I was like, this place sucks. Yeah. And I got to get out of here, And so I eventually, it's also really steep and the access was really bad. And so I was like climbing up this cliff, to get back. And it was just like, I'm over it, And then sure enough, though, I left and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then I ended up taking this course in silviculture. Silviculture is just basically how we tend the forest using the cutting of trees often as a tool. on restoring pine, oak, hemlock forest types, which is what this forest was. And I just started thinking about it, and I was like, was it so bad? Like, is there nothing that I could do? And also, if I couldn't do anything about it, who's gonna? What hope does this forest have? It just seemed like such a hopeless place. I came back a second time, and in August, or in July, I guess, and I started finding all of these really cool things. I started finding these cool little overlooks capped with reindeer moss, and these little plants that I really like, sweet fern and pink corydalis and maple leaf viburnum and bristly sarsaparilla and huckleberries and lowbush blueberries and all these red pine trees that were marked by black bears. I started finding that there was actually healthy trees that were left there. They were just so like occluded, like surrounded by these masses of unhealthy trees that they just weren't going to make it. And just started finding all of this really neat stuff, and realizing that there was hope there after all. And ended up taking that money, buying this piece of land. And now it's just been such like an incredibly empowering and also humbling learning process to then be like, here we are, and this is like, it's the problems that our ecosystems have are not always that pronounced, but all of our forest, every forest I walk into is degraded. Every forest I walk into needs help. And the only question is like, if, and I should add to that actually and we have tools that we can use to help them. And the only question is if we're going to do it. Right. So like for me, one of the funniest things is now I use the same tools, chainsaw, 1981 timberjack cable skidder. Those, I use an excavator. I've taught myself to use all these different tools to restore this forest, basically to do the reverse of what those loggers did 30 years ago, to restore this forest back to health. Taught myself to run an excavator, and I close out all the old skid trails and make them more stable and resilient. I find each individual healthy tree and release it from competition. And where there's no healthy trees at all, I cut all the trees, in these little pockets to create basically simulation, small scale natural disturbances, and allow new trees to regenerate. Taught myself to be a deer hunter because deer overpopulation and deer browse has been a problem here. And it's just remarkable to walk through this forest today. I walked through parts of it with colleagues, and they're like, this is like a nice young stand, nice young forest here. This is in 7 years.
Wow.
And I'm like, I swear to God, these trees weren't here, because it was really like, you wouldn't have seen them. My impression was that you would have walked through and you would have been like, this stand, there's no hope. And so now I've sort of, at first, where I saw this land, which I now call Bear Island, which a lot of my book is about, what I first saw as sort of like a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, now I really see as a symbol of hope, because I know what's possible. Like we can do it. And one thing that I realized is the barriers between us and doing what we need to do to care for our ecosystems is often just like, our willingness to invest ourselves in them, but then also our willingness to do this incredibly unintuitive stuff. Like I'm cutting trees, I'm using herbicide, on these non-native invasive plants. And those are two things that if you talk to 18-year-old Ethan, he would think that he would absolutely never do. But those are two things that are such profound acts of compassion for this ecosystem. And so, so that's sort of my long sustained field story, which the field story that continues to this day.
Wow.
That's awesome. Really cool.
This act of stewardship that I think is going to take my whole life.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I mean, I'm going to continue on for generations to come, hopefully. That's amazing. Man, that's awesome. I mean, I really awesome guest. Thank you so much. I definitely have more questions to talk to you about, but we should probably wrap it up soon. But I do want to give you the chance to just promote your book a little bit before we wrap it up, and just talk a bit about maybe if you have a pre-draft copy or a title or anything to show or anything like that. A little bit about the release.
It's coming out. It's coming out. It's coming out with this awesome publisher called Broadleaf Books. The release date is September 10th. You can pre-order it today, though, through basically any retailer. So,
nice.
I'd recommend do it through your local bookshop. But if you want to, you can also do it through Amazon or Barnes and Noble or bookstore.org. Again, it's called How to Love a Forest.
Amazing.
And by me, Ethan Tapper. And it's really,
By yours truly.
it's really essentially, it's a land ethic book. So it's not a cookbook like this is the tree that you cut to deal with this situation. It's like, how do we reimagine our relationship with ecosystems at this moment in time, recognizing all these things I talked about, and sort of trying to create like a template for what a responsible relationship with ecosystems might look like, and understanding that there are people that are doing this all over the place. Indigenous people here in the United States, like, that are practicing ecosystem restoration, and ecosystem stewardship at a very high level, with a high level of ecological responsibility, taking care of all the stuff. And I was realizing that there was no book that really spoke to that work that we do, and trying to create something that's not just relevant to people here in Vermont, but all those people.
Yeah.
And I'm going to butcher this saying, but it's something like, if there's a book that you really want to read and it doesn't exist, that you got to go and write it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's cool.
So that was what this one's about. And yeah,
awesome.
So and also I would just say, I've been turning up on the social media platforms as well, just promoting the book, and also just putting out lots of reels and informational videos and stuff on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. My handle is at How to Love a Forest. Cool. I'm also on Facebook as Ethan Tapper. So yeah, I would encourage folks, if they want to, pre-order the book and check out those channels.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. I feel like you'll probably be asked to come on again someday in the future to talk more forest stuff. I definitely, like I said, had more questions. I could have fired you.
I would love that. I would love that. Thanks for what you guys are doing out there. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Ethan. That was really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.
All right. Well, that was awesome. I mean, that was our first forester we've had on the show. And yeah, I definitely had a lot of questions I still would have liked to have asked him. And yeah, I mean, I suspect we can add him to the list of people that we'll have on again in the future.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's really, really, really enjoyed having him on. It was awesome.
Yeah, I thought he brought a lot of interesting and unique perspectives that, especially for us terrestrial people, we don't really think about very often. And so to kind of elaborate more on the misconceptions about forestry in general, especially for us and the general public, was really enlightening. And I think he did a really good job in explaining it in a more articulate and eloquent fashion. So he was very captivating to watch, to to listen to.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I think he brought up a lot of good points, and I mean, I think he's I think he's right. We've gotten to the point where the ship has sailed on the romantic idea that everything is fine if we just leave it alone. Unfortunately, It's not how the world is now. For better or for worse, we are where we are, and now we have to figure out strategies to move forward. Right. It's interesting though, because as I said in the interview, nothing's straight, nothing's black and white. Everything's gradients, everything's balances. And when I think about when he was speaking about a primary forest, an untouched forest that still needs attention, still needs management because of invasive species and because of overpopulation.
Oh yeah.
Then that's really interesting, because then I think about a lot of the forests that obviously I'm involved with and our organizations try to protect here. Mm-hmm. And then I think about it's so interesting how it's different, because here, for the most part, forests that are primary are still completely perfectly functioning, because overpopulation of wildlife and invasive species really aren't an issue in the Amazon, right?
Right.
So it's just interesting how to me it's interesting, but it's also, it just shows you how incredible nature is and how complex it is, and the fact that there's two different regions that require different strategies is not just a reflection of the level of human impact, but it's also a reflection of the complexities of the respective ecosystems, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, super fascinating topic. Yeah.
What I liked about it too is that, he have you ever been with someone where you're like, if I had $1 million, what would you do with it? And I
Yeah.
feel that a lot of
Cool.
people in our field were like, I would buy a lot of
Yeah.
land and I'd conserve it so that none of those big companies could ever buy. And I mean, he did pretty much what we all think about, right? What we all talk about. And I love that.
Yeah.
I feel that I tend to get really pessimistic in this field because we're just surrounded by almost doom and gloom every day. Another species is dying out. We're seeing overpopulation. We're seeing this invasive species coming out and overcrowding certain areas. And so we're combating all these other things, along with the fact that we don't get enough funding to afford a life for ourselves, but also to to promote projects and fund projects.
Yeah.
And for him to be able to get that money and from a really sad incident, but also to create something positive with it and be that positivity that we all really need. And I took everything I learned from school and things I'm continuing to learn, and I did it myself, and I'm still doing it. And he's seeing a really fruitful outcome from the last 7 years. And I think that's really inspiring. And, hopefully one day when I come up upon a ton of money like that, I can say I'll be able to do the same. And unfortunately, a lot of us aren't able to. I'm hoping to marry, Logan knows this too, like a rich sugar daddy. It's strictly platonic,
I'm
right? And
also
then pay that
looking. I
money.
have no one, so I'm definitely looking for a
I
sugar
know.
mama at this
So
point.
we're
Just
looking for those sugar mom, but it's a
sugar
platonic
daddy, maybe
relationship
depends. Maybe the
to
right person.
yeah, yeah,
Kind of
to
feel,
fund.
feel it's okay. I can live with that. So you know,
See, I
um,
just need the money, man.
I know.
It's
Just
for
I got
conservation.
it's conservation. Yeah.
It's conservation.
It's true though. It's a really good point you make, and I found that really interesting and inspiring and fascinating, and I think it also, we are in this field. You're right. We have this doom and gloom surrounding us in so many
Mhm.
cases. I drove out of the jungle today and like massive, cow fields where there should have been,
Right.
Amazon. It's of course you see it, it's obvious. But I myself have often, fought back against that depression, that doom and gloom, and one of the ways that I do feel a lot of hope for the planet is exactly what his story shows, which is that if nature's given the chance, and of course he managed it, but he gave it a chance, and he spoke about
Right.
that. He gave nature that chance, and now it's recovering. And nature is so resilient if it has the chance,
Yeah.
So the key is we just need to have. So this is why what we do is so important, because if we actually work toward conserving land in whatever form it ends up being, that's globally all these different. But if we give it the chance, it can and it will recover. We just need to give it the chance, and that's why we need to, conserve, manage land, and that's
Mhm.
why we also need to avoid extinction, because that's about the only thing that's really permanent. Is that
Right.
once it's done, bringing it back is pretty hard. But if it's there, even if it's struggling, and we give it a chance, we
Mhm.
have so many examples over the last 20, 30, 40 years of land and species recovering, that there's always that hope. And you know me well enough, Michela. I'm not a flowery person, but so my hope's based on what I think is logic, and
Mhm.
I think logically and emotionally, there's a lot of reason to have hope if we give it a chance.
Yeah. And I agree with that. Yeah, I need to be a little more positive with that because I think I've been a little bit too doom and gloom. Probably the winter blues also didn't help with that. But yeah, and absolutely. And I think that was a very inspiring just talk that we all had today. And I feel just excited for the next, thing to come, especially in our field.
Yeah,
And I think another thing, the last thing I would say is that I think he kind of thought out of the box almost too. You could either look at it this way or like, well, this is not manageable. But then he steps back and goes, well, who else is going to do it?
yeah,
And might as
hmm
well try. So
yeah,
it's like, we might as well try.
yeah,
Right. And so we have done the same thing as the early settlers did, they clear cut and they everything was farm field, everything was ag, especially in New England area. And then, here we are restoring it. It's maybe certain parts aren't great, but we're learning how to and we're
yeah,
trying. And
yeah,
so I think it's just a message to all of us. And we see so many newer, younger generation in this field that's coming. They're ready and they're like, I want to try. And I think that's amazing. And we have to
yeah,
remember that too. And for those little folks, don't get too sad. It'll be
yeah.
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. No, there's always room for hope, right? I mean, it's not an
Mhm.
easy road, but there's definitely room for that hope for sure. So we
Mhm.
definitely shouldn't give up. And his is one of many stories if we look for them that are like that. So that was awesome. It was good
Yeah.
to nice to have back on after a little bit of a hiatus.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully we'll get back in the rhythm of getting lots of good guests like that on the future. So
And don't
uh,
forget to pre-save his book, How to Love a Forest,
yeah,
too, for everyone
absolutely.
listening up there.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that right when
Yeah,
I get off
for
of
sure.
this.
And follow on Instagram,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think we'll have him on again in the future. That was awesome. So
Yeah,
I
perfect.
guess we'll wrap it up then, Michela. We
Okay.
miss you, Nick, wherever you are, gallivanting around in France, and
Mm-hmm.
we will probably. Well, who knows who we're going to see next
Filming
week?
all the
Might see
bees
you,
and
might see
birds.
him, might see me.
Who
The world's
knows?
just a mystery box waiting to be opened. We'll see what happens next week. So
That's why there's three of us.
yeah, that's
That's
exactly.
why there's three of us.
Yeah, that's right. All
All
right,
right.
thanks a lot for listening, guys. We'll see you again soon. Have a
See
good
you
week.
next week. Bye.
Ciao.